Grace, mercy, and peace to you from God our Father and from our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. So Merry Christmas! Oh, you guys were more on top of that than I thought you were going to be. It is still Christmas. We are still in the 12 days of Christmas. I was expecting you guys to say Happy New Year or something. Because traditionally in the world, once December 26th happens, what happens to all the radio stations that were playing Christmas music? They stop, right? December 26th means Christmas is over. Well, actually, it's just the second day of Christmas. And here we are on, if I'm doing my math right, like the 10th or 11th day of Christmas. And we have to be celebrating Christmas all the way up and through Tuesday, which is Epiphany, which we celebrate is actually when the wise men came. And we'll be looking at that text, and we'll be looking at the wise men next week. So we can say Merry Christmas, and we should all still be excited about that. And if you look at Philippians 2, which we just read together, but I want to look at a very specific text of this. It's an old hymn that the early Christians used to sing, and this might be one of the very first Christmas hymns. I don't know if they sang it around Christmas time because they didn't celebrate Christmas till a couple hundred years after this was written. But if we look at Philippians 2, it's all about Christmas. It's all about God becoming flesh. Basically, it says Jesus Christ, and then in verse 6 it says, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. And when we read this, we should be getting all excited. We should be feeling really good inside. We should be really excited about what God is doing because it's all about Christmas. And with Christmas, we should still be thrilled that it's Christmas time out there. But I think what happens a lot of times is by the time December 26th happens and 27th happens, and then we get to January 1st, Christmas is over. The excitement is over. You know, we've gone on our Christmas vacations and we're back home now. The Visa bill is coming in the mail and we're not looking forward to it. We've taken all of our Christmas decorations down and now our houses look bare and empty. And I think it's not just at Christmas, but I think as we go back to our lives, we can read a text like this Philippians 2 text, but sort of most of our life we kind of say, oh yeah, Jesus came, he died, I know that, but we don't get excited like we did at Christmas. And I was wondering why that was. This is a wonderful text. You know, Jesus, even though he was God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped. He emptied himself. We should be blown away every time we read this. We should be blown away that God came into the world every single day of our lives. But if you're like me, and if you're not like me, maybe you can tell me your secret. But I think if we're honest with ourselves, and you're like me, most of our days, we're kind of like, oh yeah, Jesus came. And some of our days, we don't even think about Jesus coming. We kind of wonder, you know, why does this Jesus really matter? We can say, yes, I learned it in catechism class. I learned it in confirmation. I know why Jesus matters, but deep down in my heart, I have a hard time seeing that. And we read this text, which is this awesome text about God becoming one of us, and we say, what's the big deal? Maybe you're not like me. Maybe you get jazzed up that Jesus came into the world every single day. If you do, talk to me. You need to take over my job, right? But we live in this world where I think we have a hard time seeing why Jesus matters because, honestly, we have a hard time really admitting that we need Jesus. We live in a world, in American Christianity, and I'm not saying this church, I'm not saying the Lutheran church, I'm not saying the church you grew up in did this, but over sort of, if you look at American Christianity in general, what American Christianity has preached for the last 50, 100 years is, you know what? Jesus came. And if you follow Jesus's teachings, everything will be okay. In other words, Jesus is this self-help plan to help you be all that you can be. You know, be the best that you can be. And if you do that, everything's going to be good in your life. But the problem when we do that, we sort of turn Jesus into this moralistic teaching, and the idea that he comes in the flesh isn't that big of a deal. I don't know about you. I know most of you didn't do this, but I grew up in the 80s and the 90s, primarily in the 90s. And I remember there were several slogans that we had in Christianity in the 90s. And one of them that I remember hearing all the time, and my grandparents would tell it to me, teachers would tell it to me. I even had, I think Sunday school teachers tell this to me, was try your best and God will do the rest. Has anybody heard that one before? Or you know what you can do? As long as you try your best and you meet God halfway, God will take you the rest of the way. And these are people who in the church growing up would tell me this. And I remember as a kid saying, you know what? Okay, all I was concerned about as a kid was making good grades. That was like my biggest stress. I look back, it wasn't that big of a deal. But I was saying, you know what? If I try my best, I should make an A on everything I do. And if I didn't make an A, I obviously didn't try my best because God was going to do the rest. And apparently either he hadn't done it or I hadn't done my best. But we have this idea in American Christianity for, like I said, the last 50, 100 years was, you know what? God's going to meet you halfway. God's going to help you be all you can be. He's going to teach you how to make it to the finish line and finish strong. Another thing I had growing up, maybe some of you had this or had kids or grandkids that had this, is we had bracelets, and they were the WWJD bracelets. Anybody remember those? They were popular in the 90s. And I proudly wore mine, expected to be persecuted in middle school for wearing my WWJD bracelet. And if you didn't know what a WWJD bracelet is, it stands for What Would Jesus Do? And I remember somehow by wearing this bracelet, it was supposed to cause me to think every decision I made, what would Jesus do if he was here? And if I made all of the proper decisions, I wouldn't have any pain or suffering. Everything would work out in my life. So would Jesus study for your test? Or would he go out and play? Well, he'd obviously study for the test, so you better get back studying. That's kind of the mentality that it brought. When in reality, if we look at what Jesus actually would do, he would turn the other cheek if somebody got angry at him. He would bless those who persecuted him. So if I actually did that growing up, I'd probably have quite a few black eyes and I wouldn't have been able to fight back. But we have this idea in American Christianity that Jesus is this self-help program, that he came to be this moralistic teacher where if you don't follow his rules, then you're not good enough. Do your best and God will do the rest. And when we do that, we have a hard time seeing why we need Jesus. We have a hard time getting excited about Christmas, say 10 days after Christmas Day. We spend 30 days getting ready for it. It comes and then we're done with it. Because we think we are needing to do something. We think Jesus has come in to establish rules, to establish his reign, and maybe smite us if we don't follow his rules. We don't think we need Jesus, I think, at times in our lives, because we want to be all that we can be. You guys know I was gone last Sunday. I was back home visiting family. I think everybody kind of knew that. And we flew back just a couple days ago. And it was a direct flight from Miami to Seattle, which if you're wondering how long that is to go from one corner of the country to the other corner of the country, it's 6 hours and 50 minutes, which is a long flight. But I was on top of things. I was being all I could be. As soon as I could check into my flight, I checked it. And if you did it, then you could move to exit row for free. So I arranged it. Amy and I had exit row, which was going to be this great flight for 6 hours and 50 minutes. I think we got in about midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, Seattle time. But we got there, and it was a big plane. It wasn't a little plane. And the exit row wasn't over the wing like a lot of the exit rows were. It was by the big door. It was like a full door, and the flight attendant had a little pull-out chair that kind of folded down from the wall, and she sat on that, and we were literally facing each other, looking at each other about 2 feet from each other when we took off. You might have been on a plane like that. I was happy to have the legroom. We got on the plane. We're flying back to Seattle. And it was a very turbulent flight. There must have been a lot of weather the whole way back to Seattle. So the captain kept the fasten seatbelt sign on almost the whole entire flight, which you can imagine how well that goes for a 6 hour and 50 minute flight with a pregnant wife and a whole bunch of other passengers who need to use the restroom. So what kept happening is the captain just left the fasten seatbelt sign on. And as soon as it would get smooth, for 2 or 3 minutes, somebody would get up and go to the bathroom. And then it would just start shaking like crazy again. So the flight attendant, and a lot of times the captain was saying, flight attendants, please take your seats. It was that rough. So the flight attendant's sitting right in front of me, and she had to keep grabbing the microphone saying, please sit down, fasten your seatbelts. The flight attendant says, put on the fasten the seatbelt sign. And went on and on for 6 hours and 50 minutes. I just went on and on every few minutes. It was kind of comical. But since we were sitting there and I was 2 feet in front of her for half the flight or so, I asked her, I said, how often do you guys have these problems with people not listening to you? She kind of laughed and she kind of said, all the time. And she said, well, in training, they told us this story. She goes, I don't know if it's a true story or not, but this is what they told us about when Muhammad Ali was flying. And he was flying and it got pretty turbulent. So the captain turned on the fasten seatbelt sign. And the flight attendants went to check to see if everybody was buckled in tight. And Muhammad Ali, of course, he didn't have his seatbelt on. So the flight attendant went to Muhammad Ali and said, sir, we're going through some turbulent air. You need to put your seatbelt on. And Muhammad Ali looks up at the flight attendant and says, Superman doesn't need a seatbelt. The flight attendant, apparently without missing a beat, looked down at Muhammad Ali and said, well, Superman doesn't need an airplane either to fly, so you better get your seatbelt on. I thought that was kind of funny. And I think that's kind of how we are. I think we're a lot like Muhammad Ali when we go through life. I think when we go through life, we build ourselves up. We maybe even tear other people down, and we want to be Superman. And Superman doesn't need Jesus. We go through life, we want to fix all of our problems. We want to do all these things, and we don't realize that we're on an airplane, and we need the airplane. We need God to survive because we want to be the best we can be. We want to follow that self-help program and get everything right in our world. And then when we hear Jesus comes in the flesh, he didn't consider equality with God something to be grasped and was born in human likeness and was crucified on a cross. We say, oh yeah, that's kind of, it saves me from death. But for the rest of our lives, we have a hard time seeing why Jesus matters. But in reality, if you look at the scriptures, that's not what Jesus is about at all. That's not what we are about at all. And we see this when we look at the Ten Commandments. And I use this illustration a lot. I could use it for any teaching of Jesus, but the Ten Commandments are the easiest. So you've probably heard me say this before. If you don't remember it, it's the first time for you. If you do remember it, it's great because this is important. But typically when we look at the Ten Commandments, we view them as a checklist, right? Honor your father and your mother. Oh, I did that today. I called my mom. Do not commit adultery. Oh, good. I'm still with my wife. Everything's okay on that one. Or maybe we're like, oh, well, we did that one then, but we're forgiven, so we won't do that one again. And typically we say, as long as we do that, we're going to live our best life now, right? God's going to be strong. We're going to be strong, and we're going to have this full life. We just got to follow the Ten Commandments. And I might slip up every once in a while, but generally I'm pretty good with the Ten Commandments. That's not what the Ten Commandments are about. When we look at the Ten Commandments, they're there to show us how imperfect we actually are, to show us that we actually aren't Superman, that we actually do need our seatbelt and we do need our airplane. And if we're honest with ourselves, we probably break every single one of the Ten Commandments every day. Maybe you guys don't, and if you don't, maybe you should have my job. But I pretty much break every single commandment every single day, if not at least once a week, maybe once a month. But realistically, I break them every single day. And that includes, this is my favorite illustration, the fifth commandment, which is, many of you know, is thou shalt not murder. And typically we say, oh, that one, I don't break that one, right? Those are for those guys in prison. I don't have to worry about it. But really, I will tell you, I broke the fifth commandment last week on vacation. Now, the cops aren't coming for me, don't worry, right? But I was driving in Miami, which is not a very pleasant place to drive in. And Amy and I were driving, and the roads were pretty rough, and one of the interstates actually got shut down. So what happened was all this traffic was merging, and this one guy flew around on the shoulder and cut me off and just about clipped the front bumper of my car, which wasn't my car. It was my brother-in-law's car that I was driving. And I had to slam on the brakes, and I said a few things that pastors probably aren't supposed to say. I got very angry, and I kind of spoke very ill of this driver who had cut me off, and I wished he wasn't there. Now, that doesn't happen to anybody, does it? That's just me, maybe. But basically, what I was saying there in my anger, in my bit of rage was, God, you messed up in creating that driver who cut me off and almost wrecked my brother-in-law's car. When you created that life, you obviously didn't know what you were doing. That's the same thing that a murderer says when they kill somebody. They say, God, you know what? They don't actually say this, but when they kill somebody, they say, God, when you created that life, that was wrong of you. So I'm going to go ahead and take it away. I'm going to be like you, and I don't really need you. What we see is that we're actually pretty bad people. We're actually not very good at following the rules. If we're honest with ourselves, I mean, you guys just said it. You guys just admitted it to me a few minutes ago. We went through the confession and the absolution. We talked about how we do this every time, but I think, honestly, we have a hard time coming to grips with the fact that we are poor, miserable sinners, like you guys just said. And until we can see how bad we are, we really don't see how good God actually is. You see, Jesus didn't come to be a moralistic teacher. Jesus didn't come to be an example to tell us how to live a better life, to show us how to live a better life, to get up on a ladder and tell us how to be Superman. That's not what Jesus came to do. He's not our example. But Jesus, he came to be our substitute. He came to completely take our place. And we can look back at Philippians chapter 2. We see this. It says, Jesus, who though he was of the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. See, Jesus doesn't come because we run towards him. Jesus comes because we're constantly running away from him. And that's why Christmas should be blowing us away every single time. Because even though we run from him, Jesus comes. He doesn't consider equality with God something to be grasped. He gives all that glory, and he humbles himself, becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. He fulfills everything in our place because we can't, because we're broken. And when we see how bad we are, we actually see how good Jesus is. And that really confronts our assumptions that we're Superman. Because when we see that, and we see that Jesus comes for us even in our brokenness, we realize we can't be Superman. He doesn't come to give us a self-help program, but rather Jesus comes to save us from our self-help program. Jesus doesn't come to give us a second chance. Let's face it, if he gives us a second chance, we're going to fail that time. If he gave us 1,000 chances, we'd probably fail every single time. He doesn't come to give us a second chance. Jesus comes, he gives us one chance. God's given us one chance, but Jesus is our second Adam. He is our substitute. I once heard it said, a theologian, I remember reading it in seminary, and this just really stuck with me. Said the essence of sin is man substituting himself for God. And the essence of salvation is God substituting himself for man. And that's what Christmas is all about. Jesus gives up everything so that you might inherit it, so that you might have everything. And he doesn't give it to you because you're a good person. He doesn't give it to you because you go to church every Sunday. He doesn't give it to you because you're following 8 out of the 10 commandments today. He gives it to you out of his sheer mercy. He gives it to you because he loves you, and he was obedient to death, even death on a cross. He takes your place. Jesus comes not because we do the right things, but Jesus comes because we do the exact wrong things, the things that we shouldn't do. And he comes not from a ladder, from above, from like the balcony, telling us how to be a better person, encouraging us from above to reach the finish line. No, when Jesus comes, he gives up all that. He comes as the bottom feeder. He hangs out with the prostitutes and loves them. He hangs out with the sinners, the lepers, and he loves them. He hangs out with the bottom. He hangs out with us, poor, miserable sinners. And he doesn't encourage us to do better. He doesn't encourage us to get everything right, to get to the finish line like he would from the top. That's not what he does. But rather, he hangs on the bottom on a cross. and he says, it is finished. There's nothing left for you and me to do. Jesus has given us everything. It is done. And that's why Jesus matters. That's why we should get all excited every single day. That's why we should be celebrating Christmas every single day, especially the 12 days of Christmas. Because Jesus doesn't expect you to do anything. He's done everything for you. It's done. You are his. His inheritance is yours. That's why Jesus matters. That's what Christmas is about. So this new year, I hope that you see that love that God has for you. And every day you wake up, every time you fail, you wouldn't let that failure bring you down, but you'd be freed from that failure because you know that doesn't define you, but Jesus defines you. He says it's done. You are his. Amen. May the peace that passes